wanted to take a moment to talk about my 3 different approaches that I like to use when doing drum replacement in PreSonus Studio One. Now, I've done lots of individual videos that cover specific areas of this, like making sure things are phase aligned or just general videos, but I kind of wanted to do one video that just brings everything into one, kind of umbrellaed in one video. And then if you need some additional tips, there's some other content that I can link to as well. That being said, let's take a look at a couple different scenarios. Okay. So I came from Pro Tools, and when I was working in Pro Tools, I had a very specific way that I worked, and I'm sure it was very similar to the way that most people worked, in that if I wanted to do some type of sample replacement, I was basically just making a track, having a sample of some sort like this. Let's just pretend that this was cut on a transient point, and then I would be tabbing through to this track over here, dropping down to this one, and then pasting, and then tabbing up, and then coming down here, and then pasting, and then coming up here, and then coming down, and then pasting, and so on and so forth. Now, that in itself is perfectly fine, and it serves its purpose, but one thing that you would definitely have to take into consideration is that after you do that, let's just pretend that I actually did this properly, and that these were all somewhat aligned in terms of their zero crossing point. After you would do that, you would basically have to take into account the different velocity levels. So if this one is a little bit quieter than this one, then you actually have to pull this down a little bit so that the sample track that you've created, it has a natural feel that kind of matches what you've done for your main track. And this is, of course, keeping in mind that you're not doing a 4 on the floor that has a 127 velocity all the way through. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 different approaches that I use. All right, number 1 are good old trusty bend markers. I'm going to make a range selection over here, and I'm going to split this, and let's also snip this. What I want to do here, when you do things where you're doing either bend markers or you want to use Melodyne, for example, we have a new option that was added in 5.2. We can right-click, choose audio, and we have the option to create a new clip version. What this does is it makes this version seem as if though it's a unique clip, as if though you've bounced it. Now, this can be very useful for certain tasks. I'm going to take both of these right now, and this is in my recent items. Now we have new clip versions. So the main clip is version 1, and then we have version 2, version 3. Won't really get into any more detail than that. I just say that it's a good thing to do. All right, next thing I want to do is right-click, go to my audio menu, and I want to detect the transients. Now, once we do this, Studio One runs a transient detection. We can get further information by clicking this audio band option over here. What you want to do here basically is you're just going to adjust this threshold slider so that you're only getting the samples that you need. Now, I can tell you that a kick sample over here in this track looks very different to the snare. So it's just a matter of adjusting this slider, and it's all about getting it at exactly the right spot. Basically, you want to make sure that you get the lower level kick details, but you don't want to have it too high that it also starts picking up the snare. So this is something that's pretty easy to set, and we can also kind of do this from a bird's eye view. And I'm just kind of keeping my eye on everything across the board, and something like that looks pretty good to me. And you can go in and double check if you want, make sure that it didn't get any of the snare samples. And like I said, that looks pretty good so far. Okay, so this whole process, it's usually a quick thing. You just adjust this slider somewhere we set around 73, which is where it ends up being a good fit for what we're working with. Okay, now that we've done that, what I'm going to do is open up my browser. I'm going to head over to the Instruments tab over here, and I've actually created an effects chain preset that I like to use anytime I need kind of like a little pillow of sub-low end. I'm going to just drag and drop this directly underneath, and this is just a preset, an impact preset that I've edited just kind of to taste, and I've added a couple effects plugins as well. Okay, so now that this is done, let's just zoom into selection. This is very simple. I'm just holding and dragging this down, and now we basically have an instrument part that was generated from these MIDI triggers. Okay, so if I Alt or Option double click, I can open this up. Let's close our browser. A couple things we need to take into account. We need to make sure that it's placed on the proper pitch. So let's go back here. C1, that is the pitch that we need. This is at C3 right now. I usually actually switch to the piano roll for this, if I'm being honest. I'm going to hold down Command, that'd be Control on a PC. Single click here, which allows me to basically select all of the note data that's on this particular pitch lane. And I'm going to hold down the Shift and down arrow twice. This will bring me down 2 octaves. Okay, now that this is done, this will be triggering the actual kick sample on impact. Okay, so a couple things to take into consideration over here. This doesn't really bother me, but sometimes what I will actually do is I will adjust the length, and I might make all of these, for example, 16th notes and set to all, and I'll just leave everything else as is. And now I just have these smaller MIDI triggers. It can be easier to see. And the great thing about this type of workflow, when you use the bend markers, is that we are retaining any detail in terms of the dynamics of this natural performance. So let's bring this in and let's play the two against each other. Makes a huge difference, especially when we drop it out. Obviously, from here, I still have to tweak this a little bit further, and I still have to double check my work. Now, the way that I double check my work, it can be a little bit confusing, but I have a very specific way that I like to do this. So I'm going to just click L to make sure I've located selection. I'm going to zoom in over here. And if I tab, it's going to bring me to my previous and next transient. Now I can already tell you that I made a mistake here, and this MIDI trigger over here actually doesn't need to be here. So we'll fix that as we go, but the idea is that tab will bring me to my next transient, and also Command Delete will bring me to my previous transient. So like I said, I'm basically going to go back to the very beginning of the performance. I'm going to click tab. Now in this one, really quickly, I'm going to put my focus over here, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can also lock these two windows, which kind of does help a little bit. And basically what I'm going to do is just get rid of anything that doesn't need to be there. I'm going to minimize my vertical zoom one step so I don't get that new smart tool thing that we have. And basically this is the way that you can do it. If you select the note data and click L, I can go use my right arrow key and move to the previous, or my left arrow key and L to move to the next. Now what this does when you're super zoomed in is that I can click the E key, which allows me to stay super zoomed in. I already know that in my sample editor that I've already made sure that I'm cutting this on a positive waveform of the wave cycle, so where it's going up. So I know that these kind of should be in phase. This is something that I will also have to check out as well. So again, selecting the note data, clicking L, I'm going to now click the right arrow. I'm going to click L again. That looks good. These all look good. This one, we don't need this. I'm going to double click this, and then let me just zoom out a little bit. Let's manually select this one. I'm going to click L again. I'll click E to zoom in. And also what I can do here, just to make sure, I can do a data zoom if I want to see things. So again, you want to make sure that you're zoomed in enough so that you can see the waveform, and you can also see the MIDI triggers, and I'm using right arrow key and L, and left arrow key and L. So I'm going to go back to this one over here. Now for this, I can see that this is actually a little bit off. So this is just a matter of basically me grabbing this and adjusting this and moving this to here. I'm going to click the right arrow key, L. Usually the bend markers, they do a pretty good job. If there's a little bit of a discrepancy, I'll just shift that over a tiny bit. Right arrow key, L, right arrow key, L. Okay, those look pretty good. And that would basically kind of give me peace of mind. This is another case where it didn't do the greatest job. I'm going to just pull this over. And this may seem like a lot of work. And sometimes I'll leave this as a kind of like a finishing step after I've done my mixing and I make sure that I'm happy with everything. But this is just kind of like making sure that everything is perfectly aligned. Okay, I'm just going through these one at a time. And I'm pretty OCD about this, so I do like to get things going. Another thing that I do sometimes is I have a macro that locates selection, and then Command L will move my note data. It'll basically snap it to that location. So I'll do either one of those two things. Okay, so we have everything done now. We have these MIDI triggers, and they are now perfectly aligned. Then it's just a matter of pre-mixing the two of these together. So okay, so that's one approach, and that's with bend markers. Now, the second way that we can do this is that we can send this to Melodyne. So I'm going to close this for a moment, and let me bring my data zoom back down, actually. I'm going to select this event, use my shortcut to send it to Melodyne, and of course, Melodyne has automatically detected the rhythmic algorithm. You can see everything is just on this one line, and then it's exactly the same thing. Once Melodyne has detected these, we can drag and drop and pull it down. Now, it's automatically placed them over here on whatever key this is. This is A3. I need to basically move these down. So I'm going to hold down my shift, hold down shift again, one more time. And now I want to bring this up. Now, something to take into account over here. Notice that each one of these methods interprets the dynamics slightly different. I've been trying to kind of track this down to see whether it has to do with event gain or clip gain or how these transient, like these thresholds are detected. But at the end of the day, basically what happens is in both of these methods, you do have a difference in terms of the loudest to the quieter parts. And this is really important when you're doing sample replacement or when you want to layer in samples, you definitely want it to be transparent. This is actually a pretty big deal. Now, the thing that I need to take into account over here is that I don't have much control over the way that Melodyne has interpreted these rhythmic hits. So in terms of bleed, there might be some stuff that is going through. So if I have something that's really, really clean, or if I wanted to render a gate into it ahead of time, then that might be something that Melodyne would do a really great job at. But let's take a listen to this. Okay, so let's listen to these parts over here where this is the snare bleed that's coming, and let's hear how that sounds in Melodyne. Okay, so you can see that in this particular case, Melodyne would probably benefit from having a gate actually rendered into this audio event, so you'd actually be working off of a copy to get better results. But let's take a look over here, and let's play the original. So my point is, if you're willing to do a little bit of editing over here, I can see that this one, and again, when your focus is in the editor, we can use the left and right arrow key, and I can basically determine, even just by looking, I can tell you that that is not part of it. This one here, and again, right arrow key and the L key to locate selection, deleting the ones that aren't needed, and making sure that we're only getting, like for example, this one is a kick, this one is a snare, so that wouldn't be needed. I'm going to press delete, and now I'm going to press L to locate selection. That one's not needed. I can push delete. We'll push L to locate selection again. That one wouldn't be needed. We'll push L, locate selection. I know that that's a snare, and I'm just visually seeing this over here. So when you're editing the actual note data, when you've done something with Melodyne, it can take a little bit, but the end result is pretty good. And if we play the two of those together. Now let's take a look at the actual transient detection points. I'm going to select this. I'm going to use L to locate selection, making sure that I'm zoomed in on my note data over here, and I'm zooming in on my timeline here. We can kind of see how close this is. And there are some people who are going to say this doesn't matter. It matters to me, and I always pay attention to how close this is. Now, if it's consistently off by a certain amount, like for example, this right over here, this looks like it's off at a certain amount, I would basically just select the first one, hold shift, hold end. Now I've selected all of them. Click L to locate my selection again, zoom in, and again, we're doing this with the editors linked. This kind of helps. And then I'm just going to actually offset all of them together. Oh, my grid snapping is on. I'll remove myself from grid snapping. So now the idea is that if Melodyne's algorithm is consistently like just even a tiny bit off, I can offset this together. And now I'm going to click, first of all, let's make sure that only this is selected. I'm staying zoomed in. I'm going to click the right arrow key and the L. Okay, boom, that's now perfectly on a zero crossing point. And now let's click the right arrow key again and the L, right arrow key again and the L. And some of these, we'd have to go through and make sure that we don't have any unneeded transient detection points. But you can see now that I've made that change, notice that all the kick hits, when I just did that little bit of a shuffle where I slid it over just a little bit, that seemed to really, really help out. And then the real benefit here is that we can use some things like, for example, if I wanted to double check how this looks as audio, this sample being rendered, we have the ability to do kind of like a mixdown selection, which can really help. So I can just mix this down to audio quickly, slide this up, and let's see how these look against the kick track. We want to make sure that they're relatively in phase with each other. They look pretty good, and it'll be borrowing or copying the dynamics that the actual kick drum has in the performance. So that's option number 2, is using Melodyne. And like I say, one thing that does help when you use Melodyne is that basically anytime I use Melodyne ever, I would always basically generate a copy of the track. Just pull up like a blank track and you could copy this audio event down here, just Option or Alt drag it down. And then I would basically just open up my browser and I would actually grab an expander or a gate and I would drag that onto this clip, get that set as best as possible, and then I would render that into the file. Now what that would do is Melodyne would then have a really, really clean file that wouldn't have any of the drum bleed in it, right? So either a gate, Studio One, the expander, or something to kind of help Melodyne out just a little bit. Now that being said, you know, when it has a clean file, or if you don't mind a little bit of MIDI editing, Melodyne is a really, really great option as well because it has that rhythmic algorithm, so that's something that you can do. Now I want to talk about another approach, and this is actually, to be honest, this is the one that I've been using more lately, even though it takes a little bit more, let's just say a little bit more time in terms of you actually have to let something generate the MIDI triggers in real time. Let's take a look at using now the snare track over here. So this was the kick. Now we have a snare, and it's relatively clean, but it's got some bleed. Now this is from an actual session that I just mixed. So notice, I already have the snare triggers. They are very, very accurate, and they have the velocity within them as well. So nothing over here is absolutely maxed out. It's not too low. This is a very natural velocity, and it's very close to matching the actual performance. The other way that we can do is we can use a gate. Now, Studio One has a built-in gate, and that's something that is completely usable. But I've been using a plugin. It's not new, but it's relatively new. And for me, I've actually just renamed this over here. I'll tell you why in a moment. But for me, this has to be the best gate I've ever heard in my life. And it does things to me that kind of defies logic in terms of what a gate kind of should be able to do, I guess you could say. Let me right click and let's make this a new clip version as well. I guess we didn't really need to do that, but nevertheless, let's take this particular section and I'm going to change the color of this. We'll make it something really, really bright so that we can see exactly what we're doing. So in the case where you basically have a snare track and you have a gate of some sort, like this plugin, and we're going to also look at the Studio One plugin, but this is the third option. What I'm going to do over here is I'm going to right click and I'm going to duplicate track, not complete, just duplicate track. So it's going to be sharing the same virtual instrument that I used in the actual session for the sample replacement. Now from here, notice I've named this plugin, which the plugin is called Oxford Drumgate. It's by Sonox, and if I play it really quickly, it's absolutely amazing. Like you can get everything out, you can adjust the decay and everything like that, you can adjust the frequencies. But that's not really what I want to talk about in this video. Do check this plugin out because it's absolutely amazing. But basically what this has, and a lot of gates have, is it has a way to basically take these trigger detection points that you're triggering, and then if you go to the settings, I can actually set the MIDI channel and I can set the actual note. So if I take a look at these notes over here, I need to basically know what note, again, it is that I'm triggering. Now in this case over here, let me just double click this MIDI to open it. And I think I have, okay, so D1, that's the snare that I've chosen to trigger. And I believe I have a drum map or something like that that I downloaded from Exchange. In this case, what I'm doing over here is I'm just going to extend this out a little bit. And if I go to where it says all inputs, because I renamed my actual plugin, and because that plugin is giving me MIDI information, I can choose snare triggers. And then it's just a matter of basically taking this section over here. And then I could come to this area and basically just actually record this as MIDI in real time. So I'm just going to let this record. So this is now recording all of this MIDI information, and it's recording it according to the trigger that I set up, and it's actually recording the velocity as well. So once this is done, this is being captured in real time, then I'll basically have the MIDI information that's being triggered from a gate on my audio track, and we're getting really, really clean snare triggers. Okay, so now that this is done, I'm not sure if I fine-tuned that or not, but that's okay. Let's open this up and let's take a look at it. Now, if we take a look at our velocity, you can see that we have our different velocities. But the thing that I'm, just as interested in, not just velocity, but I'm also interested to see how accurate these MIDI triggers are whenever I use something like, for example, a gate. So let's bring the two of these into view, and I'm going to actually zoom in, and we're locking our editors again. And the thing that I need to do is I'm going to just click the tab key, and I'm going to go over to the next one, and I'm going to go over to the next one, and I'm going to go over to the next one. Okay, so basically what I'm seeing is a similar thing where the offset that I'm seeing on all of these, it's actually very, very similar. So a trick that we can do is I can just slip this MIDI data. I'm going to zoom this in a little bit just so I can come over here and see the actual detail of this transient. And here is the note that I need to slip. So if I put my attention over here, and again, this is Option Command, or I guess that's Control Alt on a PC. I want to slip this MIDI note over, right over here, just to the very beginning. Now what should happen is that if I tab over, let's make our editor be in focus by using this track select over here. But now if I use my left and right arrow keys and tab over, I have to zoom out a little bit so I can see where this is being displayed. But you can see now that these are really, really close in terms of the zero crossing point. So I'm going to right click. And like I say, the advantage here is that you have something that is very, very accurate in terms of the velocity. And when you have something that's accurate with the velocity, when you blend the two of them together, it's almost an invisible process. So if I take this out of solo and let's listen to the two of these together. I'm going to slowly tuck this in. This is at, where is it at? It's at, we'll just tuck it in slowly, bit by bit, and you'll hear it. I'm going to bring my console up. So there's my snare top sample. Now, the sample, what I'm looking to get from the sample, it's actually, I don't need a ton because I already have a lot of different things. I have a snare sample that was given to me by the client. I have an actual snare bottom mic. I have my snare top. And if I listen to all of these together, let me mute the one that we just did because I've already done it in the actual mix. And I've got rooms and overheads that sound really, really good on this track. So if I solo my overheads and my rooms, and if we take a look at this one and we open up our editor, we'll see where the velocity is here. And basically what I'll do is I will adjust this velocity. So for example, on these ones over here, I would select them and I would let this play. I'd probably leave my fader at unity and I would just tuck these velocities in, moving them up all relative to each other. Now, let's talk about one more thing about using an actual virtual instrument versus a sampler. I think it's perfectly fine to find a sample that works and drag it into Impact XT or Sample One or something like that. But in some cases where I need something to have a little bit more of a like a upfront and center role, the realism that you get from a virtual instrument, which has been actually sampled with different velocities, and it's not just the same sound being played louder or softer, but it is that the sample at a lower velocity doesn't have as much attack, punch. Maybe when you get really loud, it even starts to detune a little bit or something like that. So that's the reason that I've actually been using MIDI for a lot of my sample replacement. And it takes a little bit more time, but that being said, Studio One does have some shortcuts. And the last thing I wanted to show, and then we're going to wrap this up because it's a pretty long video, is that you don't need a super amazing third-party gate like the Sonox Oxford Drumgate. you don't necessarily need that. One thing I also want to point out is that Studio One ships with a very capable gate that we can basically, I think they have some presets here. Let's try this one out. Okay, let's solo the snare. Okay, maybe we adjust the hold a bit. Okay, I'm just adjusting this so that it's only giving me the attack of the transient. Now, once you have this, then I can basically adjust this. I can turn this on. This is going to give me a fixed velocity. Okay, that's the one thing to note, is that I can adjust the velocity from from 0 to 127, but it is fixed. So you will have to do a little bit of finessing on this. But this is the other thing that I wanted to point out, is that I can basically choose the note that I want to trigger, which in this case is going to be D1. I'm going to push enter. Let's say that we want to trigger this. Let's leave it where it was. It was set to 100. It would be really nice if they had some way that it would give us some, more dynamics in terms of the velocity. But now we have this gate that's set up over here. I could go back to the exact same track. And let me go to a different part. For example, let's go over here. We'll go into this track that we had set to snare triggers, and we're just going to choose gate. Now I'm going to solo this out, and I'm going to put this into record mode, and I'm just going to record. So now that we've recorded this, it's the exact same thing. We have this information. I can open it up in an editor. Notice that the velocities are all the same. So if you really wanted to be kind of smooth this out a little bit, I would probably recommend, at least, by ear, adjusting some of these and at least looking for the ones that are quieter, perhaps, like maybe these two over here, and bringing their velocities down. And then relative to each other, this one's a little bit lower. So it would take a little bit of work. But the cool thing about this is that we have the ability, again, I have the MIDI track selected, and I can then select one of these and then use L to locate selection, right arrow, L again. And if these two are linked, my E will allow me to zoom in and see everything. And then I can see how these are looking. And again, it's looking like a very similar thing where the offset in terms of where things are, it looks very, very similar to me. So what I would do in this case is I would come over here, I would hold down Command, I would click all of them, and then I would click L to go back to the beginning. I would zoom in a little bit, and then basically I can just take all of these because they're all selected, make sure my grid snapping is off, zoom in a little bit more even, and I would just pull this back to here. And then now that should be better. I'm going to choose the right arrow key and L. I wish this was on the other side, but now you can see here. And then of course, the last step we would want to do is anytime that I do something like this, it's very easy for us to render this in lots of different ways. For now, I'm just going to do a really quick way of, pulling up a stereo track. And then I can just drag and drop this directly down, and it will automatically render this into an audio file. And then, like I said, my last step would be that I'm checking to make sure that everything looks good and it's playing, they're playing in phase with each other and everything like that. So that is the 3 different approaches that I use. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I use the bend markers, but if I have the time, I will usually use a Drumgate, and I've been using the Sonox Oxford Drumgate, and I've actually just been using it to gate the snare. And even if I don't end up gating the snare in a mix, I will use it simply to generate the MIDI triggers because it does a really, really great job of keeping everything sounding really, really realistic to me. And then from there, basically, the end result is that I just tuck these things in. So here's an example of me rendering a sample from a gate and then just kind of blending it back with the original track. And I think the drums sound really, really good, and they still sound like real drums, but you have the kind of like the punch and the bottom end that you need, or the reinforcement. It's there and it's coming from the samples. And I guess just as a last step, maybe we'll remove this track over here. We'll remove this one. I'll pull this one back. We don't need this anymore, actually. This was a duplicate, but you know, at the end of the day, you get a pretty decent sounding drum sound. And if I was to mute the actual samples that I tucked in, this one I haven't even rendered it to audio yet. And then the last step for me, when I'm done, before I want to archive this mix, I will usually leave these in and double check everything. But the very last step is that I'm always right clicking and I'm transforming this to audio track. And then depending on what type of processing that I've done, in this case, it's a Pro EQ and Oxford Dynamics. The very last step for me at this point is right clicking and transforming to audio. I will always preserve the instrument track state, always. I will usually remove the instrument, and most of the time I actually don't render the inserts just in case maybe I mess something up, and I just set the tail accordingly. And then it's just a matter of this is going to actually turn this instrument track into an audio file, which is basically the same thing I've done here with the kick sample. I can continue mixing, and if I've made a mistake or I need to go back and adjust anything, maybe if something's clicking, then I can adjust all that. But here now we have, you know, a really realistic sounding snare sample that's been added to our snare top, snare bottom, and actually, in addition to that, the client sent me a snare sample as well. And if we play them all together, and then in terms of the mix, it's whatever you want to do. I actually don't have that much stuff on this mix. A little bit of parallel compression, some auto align to get it in kind of working, but this is mostly a fader mix in terms of getting the drums to sound decent here. That's a long video, but hopefully some of these things that I've shared with you can come in handy with your workflow at home. Anyways, that's all the time I have available for today. Any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I will do my absolute best to get back to you. And as always, we will catch you in the next video. Cheers.